We're grateful to all of you for being here and for valuing the past, present, and future of American writing. We're here tonight to discuss Jess McHugh's new book, Americanon, A History of the United States in 13 Books. It's a look at the types of books that truly define American culture, those that tell us how to read, how to cook, how to clean, how to win friends and influence people. Overlooked for centuries, our simple dictionaries, spellers, almanacs, and how-to manuals are the unexamined touchstones for American cultures and customs, she writes. These books sold tens of millions of copies and set out specific archetypes for the ideal American, from the self-made entrepreneur to the humble farmer. Jess is a writer, editor, and researcher whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Paris Review Daily, the New Republic, Fortune, and the Village Voice, among many, many other publications. She joins us tonight from her family's home in Massachusetts. Welcome, Jess.
Hi, it's so great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
I understand, I have a lot of questions about this fascinating premise for a book, but I understand before we get to those that you have a passage that you'd like to read for us.
Yes. So I figured I would start off with a short kind of passage to foreground it. And so I'll start with the epigraph and just a little bit from the introduction. So, that which we do is what we are. That which we remember is, more often than not, that which we would like to have been, or that which we hope to be. Thus, our memory and our identity are ever at odds. Our history ever a tall tale told by inattentive idealists. That's Ralph Ellison. Nothing seemed to dampen the din of Noah Webster's home in the early 19th century. With his 7 children running through the house, peals of laughter and shrieks of play punctuated his workdays. The sound of water boiling for tea or his wife preparing lunch. There was never silence. Try as he might, Webster could never find the peace required to concentrate. One day, a solution finally dawned on him, a material that could dull even the boom of a crashing ocean. He filled the walls of his study with sand. Finally free to think in silence, he turned to his life's work, writing the American dictionary. Noise would be only one of Webster's innumerable foes throughout his decades-long project. He feared regional division, foreign cultures, and variations in accent. His plans for the dictionary and for the United States at large extended far beyond the task of lexicography. Webster longed to codify national identity, to create a single galvanizing definition of American. His critics decried his project as perfectly absurd, vulgar, and subtle poison. But Webster's dictionary would succeed in becoming one of the perennial bestsellers in US history, defining much more than words for generations of Americans. In writing a dictionary that many Americans now refer to as simply the dictionary, he hoped to give them a blueprint for shared culture. It will become one of a number of American Bibles, those dog-eared books for daily life that ostensibly taught readers one subject, all while subtly instructing them about their role in society and their responsibilities to family and to country. These were dictionaries, school primers, cookbooks, how-to guides, and self-help manuals, spanning the full range of our 245-year history, many of which sold tens of millions of copies, setting out specific archetypes for the ideal American, from the self-made man to the entrepreneur to the devoted homemaker. What makes these books so compelling and why they are worth studying is that underneath their surface are the blueprints for American values that endured long after publication. The foundation for American popular culture can be located more easily not in highbrow literary books, or even in the Constitution, a text that fewer than half of Americans read, but in the ordinary instructional books that average Americans have consulted every day. Like many Americans, I grew up with Merriam-Webster's dictionary and the Old Farmer's Almanac, as well as cookbooks, advice books, and all other types of self-help and how-to books. I also credit my maternal grandfather in particular for my interest in these books. He was a quick-witted person with a love of learning, always reading biographies and travel books, and he had a special fondness for the kind of self-improvement books that fill the chapters of Americanon. At the top of the family split-level home in Stoughton, Massachusetts, he hung framed copies of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence alongside Poor Richard's Almanac. Later, as a journalist, I became fascinated by these types of books as cultural objects after I learned of Webster's fanatical motivations by way of an offhand comment in a lecture. I had never imagined that the dictionary that sat on my shelf, guiding me through primary school and then college, and even the early phases of being a journalist, had been written by a born-again Christian nationalist who hoped American English would become as different from British English as Swedish or Dutch was from German. In revisiting these books and their messages about Americanness, we have the opportunity to look at the truths that we take for granted about our country. What are the ideals that we still unfailingly believe at the core of ourselves? What are the stories we have told ourselves so often and so convincingly about what being an American means that they seem beyond question? Perhaps the one that resurfaces the most is that the United States represents a place where anyone can go to try something new, to be self-made. What I saw in my Irish ancestors who had toiled in Massachusetts mills, or in my Italian great-grandmother who was forced to drop out of high school to work in a shirt factory, but went on to become a respected leader in local politics, is what so many of us like to believe about the United States, that we all have a chance. But this is the place where hard work and the right attitude can be leveraged for a better life. And sometimes that's true. And the many stories like those in my own family and in so many other American families serve as a testament to that belief. It is hardly true for everyone who has come here, however, and as it is at present truer for residents in countries such as France, Denmark, and Canada. These stories, the mythical ones that have come to feel like objective truth, are the ones I hope to look at most closely here. This book is more a reevaluation than a revisionist takedown. Just because we have often failed to live up to our own ideals does not mean that they cease to exist. Re-examining popular culture is an exercise in disillusionment, even humility. Living as an American in France, I am frequently lectured in all the ways the United States is uniquely bad. Usually some combination of geopolitical hawkishness and the Coca-Cola Corporation. It has made me curious about the ways in which we are unique, even if not uniquely good. In writing this book, I found myself at times disappointed by and at times nostalgic for the United States as I had understood it as a child, or for the United States of Frank Capra movies, all while understanding that this vision of America was necessarily unreal, a combination of partial truths, mythos, and imagination. The word nostalgia comes from the Greek nostos, for coming home, and algos, for pain. I hope this book can serve as a homecoming for those who reckon with our complex history and yet still hope, despite everything, to return to the place they are from.
Thank you. That was wonderful. So I wanted to start just by asking you to sort of talk us through the process of choosing which books are represented in your book and why those books are particularly important.
Sure, it's a great question. So I wanted to imagine this sort of alternative canon of how-to books or daily books. And I wanted to avoid any kind of regional bias or personal bias. So I tried to focus pretty heavily on the data. I looked at kind of which books sold consistently well over history. It was often in the kind of tens of millions of range. I also looked at lists such as, Publishers Weekly. The Library of Congress did a 100, books that shaped America. The kind of usual suspects, New York Times, etc. I also really kind of dug into a lot of the archival work in terms of looking at, not just what sold well, but what struck a chord in the conversation. I interviewed something like, I think, close to 100 academics in different fields about which were the books that kind of influenced the culture or the customs of the time. And then third, I kind of get all of the nitty gritty in the introduction a little bit later, but I also think of Americanon as kind of a starting point, and that these are, I would say, books that are representative in some way, but that they can certainly vary based on culture and region and generation and what have you.
What was the first book like this that was important to you, and why did it have such an impact on you?
I really liked this question. I think I would say Webster's Dictionary, which is kind of a funny one because when I was a kid, I had a copy of Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, and this might not surprise anyone here given the book that I've written, but I was kind of a nerd. And so I would read this book before I went to bed, and I would read different definitions from the book because I thought that it would make me smarter, and I thought it would make me seem smarter to other people. And it mostly just led to me mispronouncing a lot of words. So I remember seeing a sign when I was a kid and saying to my parents, "Oh, a pedestrian crossing." So it didn't quite work as planned. But what I was delighted by in the research was that I found that I'm not the only American to have done this, and that the idea that reading the dictionary or using the dictionary could make you not just be smarter, but perhaps seem smarter is something that a lot of people have done throughout history, and that it's often kind of been used as a tool of self-education and social mobility.
I think everyone, if they weren't that kid, knows that kid, knows,
Yeah.
knows someone who did that, and learned those words by learn those words by reading them rather than hearing them spoken out loud. So
Yes,
I'm
like it was
calling it
me.
pedestrian from now on. That's just how it is.
Thank you. I'll give you that.
That just sounds so much better, so much more better.
It's very elegant.
Yeah. When I was looking through your table of contents and the books that you chose to represent this Americanon, I was struck by some of the similarities to the works that are in the American Writers Museum. So for those of you that are watching along at home and aren't familiar, we take a small d democratic view of American writing. So we include, your literary fiction and your narrative nonfiction, but also self-help and plays and experimental poetry and advertising copy. And so things that are, that are great pieces of writing, whatever their purpose. And so when I was looking at, the books that you've chosen, Jess, I was curious why we often undervalue books like this when we talk about the nation's writing or the nation's literature. Are we undervaluing books like this and overvaluing something else?
Mm. I think that's a great question. It's hard to say because I also love, literary fiction as well. So it's hard to say, can we ever overvalue it? I think at the same time, and I wonder sometimes if it's partially a consequence of being a young nation that we really wanted to kind of stake our claim in the sort of literary territory, and so we refrain from maybe delighting in the mundane in the way that I wish we would. But I hope that people will value these books a little bit more because they weren't just books. I also see them as kind of shapers of culture, because especially in the early days of nationhood, late 18th, early 19th century, most people didn't own many books, if any. They certainly didn't own, literary fiction. And so if they did own a book, it was maybe a Bible, although something like 40% of New England households didn't even own a Bible. They owned an almanac maybe, or a speller, and then later, maybe Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. So I think when you only have these few books, and not only are they the only books that you own, but you probably are reading them more than once, they take on such a grander effect, not just on individuals, but I think on the culture at large.
When you were asking people what books were important to them in this vein, did you receive any answers that that surprised you, that you weren't expecting?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think. It's funny because whenever I tell people that I'm writing or have written a book about bestsellers, people usually rattle off a list of books, and a lot of the time it's books I haven't heard of, or it's books that I have heard of but haven't read. I would say one of the books that people have suggested a lot is Who Moved My Cheese? That was one that came up a lot. Oprah books are also books that kind of surprised me. I'm trying to think. I think a lot of people associate, again, bestsellers with fiction. So people would ask me about books such as, Catcher in the Rye or Uncle Tom's Cabin or things of that nature. But I wasn't one of the surprising ones that I think was a good suggestion and was one that I had on the list and then took off and put back on and yada yada. It didn't end up making it into the book, but The Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, I thought was an interesting suggestion because it did sell, I think, something like 30 million copies, and it certainly was a humongous bestseller, especially in the 30s and in the wake of the Depression.
Well, and in terms of books that have been influential, yeah, that seems like that would be at the top of
For sure.
the list. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned just a moment ago, and I was we were talking before this event started a little bit about the McGuffey Reader. And you mentioned the idea of some of these books as tools to sort of tell Americans who they should be or define what our national culture should be. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the McGuffey Reader and, why that book in particular became so widely associated with Americanness.
Sure. I think that's a great question. The McGuffey Readers are interesting to me. I think they're less of a household name in New England. I know that they come from Ohio. And so for those who aren't familiar, they were these school primers that basically educated you from learning the alphabet all the way through up to high school with kind of literary passages from Washington Irving and the like. And they were written by this man, William Holmes McGuffey, who was kind of this child of the frontier. He was swaddled in empty maple syrup trough, and he, his parents cleared the land, and he grew up in this log cabin made out of the surrounding woods. So he lived this very pioneer lifestyle, and they were devoutly religious people. And his mother's greatest hope for him was that he would become a Presbyterian minister, which is what he did become, alongside an ancient languages professor. He was, very deeply steeped in this kind of Calvinist theology. And so the books that he wrote are fascinating to me because they're very clearly this mix both of Calvinism and of maybe what we will call pioneer frontier values. So there's a lot of, A is for Axe and stories about frontier children. And what's fascinating to me is that he is quite an extreme person, even for his time. He thought dancing was a sin, and he once expelled so many people that by springtime, I think there was one senior left to graduate. But what he did succeed in doing is that despite, or perhaps because of his kind of ideology, he was able to put Americanness on the page in a way that was a relatively wide enough tent. And so people kind of really rallied around this, that was kind of this sort of civic religion that was very much part of what people understood as the purpose of common schooling.
Yeah. And do you think it was conscious, or was it because you could view, obviously there's a way to look at that as insidious, right? To say, oh, he was trying to push a particularly strict religious agenda, or he was trying to, but he was also trying to teach people to read. And so was he trying to balance that consciously, or was that sort of an unintended thing?
I think it's a little bit of both. He's pretty clear about the fact that he thinks the Bible should be seen as a national text. And so he writes about this in the introduction to one of the volumes, saying something like, "From no other source has this author drawn more copiously than from sacred scripture." So I think he was aware of what he was doing. And to a certain extent, he might seem extreme to us. But in his time, he wasn't as extreme compared to what came before him. So I think, to answer your question, yes and no. He was aware of it, but I think to a certain extent, there were a lot of other people who also saw the Bible as a national text. Even Horace Mann from Massachusetts, who, us Bostonians think of as kind of quite a secular person, assumed that Bible reading would be part of school. I think the religiosity of the time was kind of apparent to everybody, and especially at a time when there was so much disagreement over public schooling that there were even riots in Philadelphia in which something like 33 people died. Some of them were stabbed to death with broken beer bottles over which translation of the Bible would be read in school. I think comparatively, he fits in a fairly less offensive way.
Compared to that, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you look at the longevity of a book like that, that what we think of as fairly recent history was still being shaped by people who grew up with books like that. Was that the case with all of the books that you researched, that they all had sort of this sort of long afterlife, even after their writers were gone?
Almost all of them. I think that was what was fascinating to me, was that, these books live a life during the kind of lifetime of their author, but they often live a much longer and sometimes more intense life afterward. I think of someone like Noah Webster, whose book really didn't take off until long after he had died. And with McGuffey, that was certainly the case because, for instance, Henry Ford grew up, learned how to read with those books, and was such a huge fan that he paid to have McGuffey's childhood home reconstructed log by log in Dearborn, Michigan. He reprinted the books. So I think there is a lot of that. And that's what fascinated me about the book, was that not only were their authors quite intense, that motivated that their books would survive, but so many people, whether they're descendants or their kind of intellectual descendants, pick them back up, whether it be, the editors of the Old Farmer's Almanac that still publishes every year, or Emily Post descendants who still publish new books every year. So I think that's certainly been the case for a lot of them.
That there was this long-lasting hunger for that type of content. I was struck by how all of the books that you've chosen are in some way about how to improve ourselves, or how to improve and better understand what we are doing. And so is there something uniquely American, do you think, about that drive to make ourselves better?
I've thought about that quite a lot. I'm not sure if it's uniquely American, but I would say it's very strongly American. Self-help is kind of everywhere now, and you can find it in Japan and South Korea and Europe. But I do think it feels a fundamental part of some of our most foundational values. So I think even going back to someone like Benjamin Franklin, you see he has this really strong emphasis on practicality and usefulness, and that which is useful is good. And I think that, especially in a nation that has come to value meritocracy and being self-made, it makes sense that we love self-improvement, because if the only thing standing between you and a better life is you, then you could always have more and you could always be better. And if you have, $2.99 and you can buy this book and that's going to help you, that's always going to be appealing. And I think that narrative is something I tried to nuance a little bit, because of course it's not as simple as that, but that's, I think, deeply ingrained in how we understand success to work.
I just want to remind folks, as Jess and I are talking, that if you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I'm monitoring that and I can read questions out for you. So if there's something that you'd like to ask as we continue. So one of the books that you chose is about sex. So
That's right.
Why that particular book?
Well, that book was a little bit inevitable because since I was looking at the data, I think it sold something like close to 100 million copies. It really took off, which was saying a lot, because this book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex, came out in 1969, when there were plenty of books coming out about sex, believe it or not. What was fascinating to me about this one was that it still seemed quite preoccupied with thinking about what kind of nation will we be. And so ideas about sex were also ingrained with, or I would say imbued with, ideas about society, whether they be gender roles. Looking back, it's a deeply homophobic book. It's actually a kind of a deeply racist book as well. And the more that I looked at the history of sex advice, for instance, the more I was quite surprised to see that it had always been very conscious of itself as a nation builder. So, the earliest sex books in America came out of the eugenics movement. And it was this idea of positive eugenics, which is to say, by encouraging a certain type of person to procreate. And that's how those books first started, which was deeply disturbing, but it makes more sense the more you read even into the 60s and 70s. These books, you see that they're really guiding people towards procreative relationships.
Married life.
Yes.
So they wanted you to be, you know, to enjoy yourself, but within the bounds of what they prescribed as the right way to do that.
Right. And even what was surprising to me was that even in, you know, the swinging 60s, Dr. Rubin's idea of the right kind of marriage was still, you know, heterosexual marriage, white marriage. He makes it very clear that there should be no mixing between peoples. It's really kind of shocking.
Yeah. Yeah. When you look at some of the things that some of the books that have endured, whatever their, you know, whatever the difficulties with some of the content of them, when you look at the books that have endured, are you seeing anything that leads to, okay, this is now sort of a unified self-help theory? This is a, you know, this right now is where we're at in terms of how to do all of it. Are we getting to the point where, you know, we are now getting all of our life advice in one place as opposed to a library of it?
That's an interesting question. I think there are certain of these that have really stuck. Like, I think, for instance, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People is quite a sticky book. And so it was written in 1936, which I think is kind of surprising because it still sells something like 100,000 copies a year. So I think that that's really become, you know, the guide to salesmanship for a certain swath of Americans. I would also say kind of what has changed is that now kind of the internet can be people's library. And so people don't need to buy a sex book and a spelling book and a farming book. They can just sort of Google the answers to things, which I think has made some of these books less potent. Like, for instance, How to Win, or Everything You Always Want to Know About Sex is no longer selling very many copies. At the same time, what's fascinating to me is something like the Old Farmer's Almanacs sells about 3 million copies a year. And you would think, what is a 1792 farming guide doing on the bestseller list consistently? But I think it goes to show you that when something does really capture a potent corner of American life, that it continues to attract an audience and it continues to have something to offer.
Yeah, yeah. That was one of the, when we were, when our content leadership team was developing the Writers Museum, that was one of the criteria that they used was, you know, an author's work, was it a writer's work, was it important in their own time, and also would it still be relevant today? Can you still find something in that work to relate to today? And when I was looking down your list, that was what I thought of, was that all of these things, all these books still have something to say to us.
Definitely. I think that was what was so fascinating to me in doing the research, was just how modern a lot of these books can feel. The Almanac is one that comes to mind. Somebody once described it as proto-internet-y because it basically is kind of like a pocket internet. It does have, you know, jokes and recipes and stories and information about mating your animals and tide tables and sunsets. And I think that there's something kind of beautifully contained about that, and it attracts in a different way than it attracted somebody in 1792, and perhaps it's serving a slightly different, more nostalgic function, but it still has something to bring to the table.
As a writer, what was your process for writing this book, and how did that differ from your writing process during your work as a journalist?
Sure, that's a good question. I think for this one, the primary difference was that it required a lot of travel to kind of far-flung archives, which was fun. I mean, there's so much stuff that can be accessed on the internet, but a lot cannot be accessed on the internet. And so back in 2019, pre-COVID time, or maybe 2020, I can't recall, I did this long road trip to all of these different archives. So the Old Farmer's Almanac has its own office where they keep all of these kind of old documents in Dublin, New Hampshire, which has about 1,000 people in it. And then I went to, Burlington, Vermont for Emily Post's archive, which was just her great grandkids at their parents' house in a box somewhere. And then I went to, where else? Minneapolis, to the Betty Crocker, or the General Mills archive where the Betty Crocker documents are. So that was what was fascinating, is that there was a lot of kind of hands-on with the material, or maybe there was one librarian just saying, here's a box of stuff, do whatever you would like. So that was wonderful. And then I think what I also loved, and what I love about reporting in general, is that I love meeting people and getting to speak to people and interview people. And that was a huge process. A huge aspect of this book was interviewing, kind of, as you mentioned, some of the legacy keepers of these books, whether it be the descendants of the writers or the authors, or I got to interview this woman who worked at General Mills during the late 40s when Betty Crocker was in her heyday. And so that's always a highlight for me, is to kind of see the view from the ground.
Were any of them, particularly the familial descendants, surprised by the interest?
That's a good question. I would say they were mostly, delighted. I love that I was always kind of welcomed with open arms everywhere I went, which is different than being a journalist in that regard. So that was nice. Yeah, I remember meeting Emily Post's descendants and being very nervous, but they were the most laid back people I've ever met. They were very late to the interview, which weirdly put me at ease. And she came in with a rescue dog in tow, and we ate noodles. It was not at all what I was expecting. So
you were expecting the etiquette queen's pupils to be.
Yes, I had on a very finely ironed shirt and pants, and yes, it all went out the window in the best way.
Maybe that's the modern etiquette. Etiquette is always bring a dog. If you're going to bring a dog, and and be enthusiastic.
That's good advice for any situation.
Exactly. When you look back at some of the older, advice columns and advice volumes like this, there's that. I'm thinking of the thing that goes around every couple of years, where it's, advice to women about how to properly treat their husbands, things like that. This is a 1950s housewife's expectations, and it always goes around. And I remember reading things like that and thinking, this isn't necessarily bad advice if it's directed at everyone in the relationship and not just the women, you know what I mean? Things like that, where it's not necessarily the work itself, it's who it was aimed at and what the intent was. Were they trying to coerce certain behaviors, or were they genuinely trying to make people happy? And so looking at that, I wonder if there are parts of these books that you read thinking, this would be good if people still did this.
That's a good question. I think Betty Crocker is a good example of that, because, the Betty Crocker cookbook is the best-selling cookbook in American history. I think it sold something like 75 million copies, and there is a lot of good advice in it. I mean, if you want to know how to make anything, the Betty Crocker cookbook can tell you. I mean, I think it's 492 pages long or something, and there is certainly some good advice in it. And again, if it were directed toward all people, I think that would be fine. I think the issue that arises with so many of these books is that they tend to be directed toward a group of people, which is to say, often toward kind of middle-class people, or middle-class white people and those who want to become them, which is to say, new immigrants, nouveau riche, the idea that if you follow a certain amount of directions, you can become what you want to be, which is a flawed idea, both because it's not always true and because it doesn't have to be that way.
Mm-hmm. I just want to remind people we're going to be reading some audience questions out. So if you'd like to type a question into the Q&A box, we're taking a look at that. So you may have answered this a little bit earlier with the answer about the AA book, but I was curious as to whether there were books that you initially considered for this book and then discarded.
Yes, there were, because it was a long process of researching and writing. The big book was one of those books. The other was Dr. Spock's baby book. So that was a big bestseller. In the end, I just felt that it was too similar to kind of some of the themes in Betty Crocker, and it came out at a very similar time. And then what else? I almost put in Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, but I felt that it wasn't quite a didactic book in the way that these other ones were. But certainly, I think, again, it really is what I like to think as a starting point, and it's a book. I would be curious, 50 years from now, what would be the book from today that might kind of summarize us?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And one I was gonna turn around on you is, what do you think is yeah.
I really set myself
what
out
do
there.
you think is what do you think is the enduring book of today that is sort of the signpost?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it is harder to say, just because, which is great news. There are way more books being published, and there's much more of a diversity of voices of books being published, which is wonderful. And I think what it does mean, though, is that there's no longer 122 million people reading the same book in the way that there was in, say, the 19th century. I would say, I think some of those books that might go on that list 20, 30, 50 years from now would be something like Oprah. I do think a lot of the Oprah books were very representative of their moment. Even something like The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, I think, represents a certain dis-ease and anxiety that people have in our day and age. I think, any book that responds to uncertainty or anxiety with this sort of desire to organize via advice is something that I would define as kind of filling this same hole, because so many of these books arose out of times of chaos, whether it be war or economic depression, and kind of served as a refuge from ambiguity. And I think that, present day self-help can do that in quite a similar way.
So maybe our post-corona books are being written right now.
Yes, I would be very curious about that in particular.
Yeah. I have a question from Gary, who wants to know what book you're working on next.
That's a great question. I don't have a new book yet. I'm working on a feature piece, which is about Mustangs, wild horses. And it's about the kind of future of the American Mustang, which has become something of a thorny conservation issue because they're overpopulated in the West, but they're this kind of beautiful, symbol of American, freedom and what have you, and they're protected species. And so I'm going up to this farm in upstate New York in a couple of weeks to do some reporting on this. There's a kind of horse barn that brings in horses from the Bureau of Land Management out west and uses them for this really interesting program to treat veterans who have post-traumatic stress disorder. And they train wild Mustangs so that they can be adopted out as kind of regular working horses. And it seems to work very well, both for human and horse. So that's kind of my next big reporting project.
And you get to spend some time around some horses, which is nice.
Yes, that was really all I was looking for, was to meet a wild Mustang.
That is the best part about my background's in journalism as well. And that is sometimes the best part is, I've always wanted to go skydiving. Let's do a story.
Yeah, exactly. I kind of think about being a journalist as you get to be professionally curious about whatever you want, and then you just call people up and ask them very personal questions about it. So it's a very wonderful job.
And sometimes they even answer them.
Exactly, to everyone's surprise.
Yeah. The question from Lois, who wants to know if any of you took any of the advice that you read in the books that you chose. Did you make any Betty Crocker recipes or win any friends and influence people?
I did win some friends. You know what? This was advice I took because I'm not a combative person, but I'm an opinionated person. And I will say that I do notice that sometimes I'll, get into an argument with somebody at a dinner party for no reason. And one of the things Dale Carnegie says is, if somebody says they love something and you hate it, you can just say nothing. You can choose to say nothing about it. And I found that is actually excellent advice. If somebody read a book I didn't like or watched a TV show I didn't like, I don't need to tell them that I didn't like it. And that's been actually profoundly useful advice. And I think I'm going to keep following that as long as I possibly can.
That is fantastic advice. And I'm afraid that if everyone followed it, we would have no internet.
That would be wonderful.
We've got time for a couple more questions, folks, if you'd like to type yours into the Q&A box. I wanted to ask you a little bit while we wait to see if anyone else has anything to ask. I wanted to ask a little bit about Benjamin Franklin, also, who, we've mentioned a couple of times, his autobiography. And, that was a wonderful example of someone using their own life for propaganda purposes. And and having a fantastic time doing it. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about why that particular book and what you discovered about it that you didn't know before you started researching it.
Yes, that's a super interesting one, because it is, as somebody who went to American public school, you know Franklin's story. Everybody knows Franklin's story, I think, to a certain extent. And so I went in there kind of expecting not to learn particularly much more. But what is really interesting about that book is like you say, he's telling his life, but he's also at once kind of selling himself and selling the idea that is America. And so he's presenting a very specific vision of his life. What I found interesting about it was that I learned that he wrote it, or started writing it, at kind of a down point in his career. He had just had this diplomatic failure in England. The Americans thought he was not American enough. The Brits thought he was too American. And he just kind of felt like he didn't fit in. And so he starts writing the book almost as a correction of his life story. And you can see the ways in which he's very conscious of public relations and publicity. And he's also writing the first kind of American self-made man tale, and the first America rags to riches story. And so I think it's then the way that he pitches America, or after his death, the way that America is pitched to people abroad and is pitched to new arrivals to America. And that was also interesting to me, was that it was one of those books that was made so available that people who were migrant workers would carry it around, people who were new immigrants would have it. It was not a difficult book to get, and therefore it kind of did promulgate a very specific story, both about Franklin and about the nation, quite early on.
Yeah. He was doing Oprah's book club before she did.
Exactly, but only for his book.
Only for his book. Well, really, I mean, wouldn't you?
Oh yeah, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, we could talk absolutely all night, but I know you have other events and other things to get to. Since the book is officially out, would everyone please go to the chat and check out our link to Seminary Co-op to purchase? So you can follow that link. You can also get it at our bookshop.org page. And I want to thank you, Jess, for being here, and ask you if you had any final thoughts you wanted to share.
I think that's it. Thank you so much for having me. I hope that people enjoy the book and kind of find a new delight in the mundane, as I have. And just thank you so much for taking the time.